7:30 in the morning, October 27th, 1943. Aurelio Tassone sat in the operator's seat of a 24-ton Caterpillar D bulldozer, watching men die on a beach he'd never heard of until yesterday. The air hung thick with humidity and diesel exhaust. Through gray haze drifting over the water, he could see New Zealand infantrymen scrambling ashore into machine gun fire. Tracers cut through mist like angry fireflies. Bodies were falling on the sand, not collapsing dramatically like in the movies, just dropping, suddenly empty, suddenly gone. Tassone was 29 years old, from Milford, Massachusetts. Calloused hands that knew the weight of tools before they knew the weight of weapons. 15 years operating heavy equipment, building roads, clearing land, doing the kind of work that paid bills and kept food on the table for his wife Helen back home. The Navy recruited him because he could run a bulldozer better than almost anyone alive. His job was simple: clear roads, build airstrips, construction work, not combat. He wasn't supposed to fight the Japanese. But in the next hour, Aurelio Tassone would turn a piece of construction equipment into a weapon of war. What he did that morning would change how the military thought about improvised warfare and establish a tactical innovation that would save countless lives across the Pacific. The real story doesn't start with the heroism. It starts with the problem, and to understand why a construction worker sitting in a bulldozer even mattered, you have to understand what was killing those New Zealanders on that beach. Japanese military engineers had spent months fortifying the Treasury Islands. They'd learned from earlier battles what worked, what didn't. Their solution was elegant in its brutality: the pillbox, a bunker constructed from heavy coconut logs stacked horizontally, packed with sand. Logs layered 2 and 3 deep with firing slits cut at precise angles to maximize fields of fire while minimizing vulnerability. Coconut wood was perfect for this. Unlike hardwoods that splintered under impact, coconut logs were spongy, fibrous. They absorbed shock instead of shattering. A direct hit from a naval shell would blow sand everywhere, gouge chunks from the logs, but the structure itself often remained intact. Japanese engineers had discovered this through trial and error in the early months of war. They built their pillboxes low to the ground, covered them with palm fronds and jungle vegetation. Let nature do the rest. Within weeks, a newly constructed bunker would be virtually invisible from the air. From the ground, you might walk within 20 feet of one and never see it until the machine gun opened fire. These fortifications had been killing American and Allied troops for months. At Guadalcanal, Marines threw themselves against coconut log bunkers in frontal assaults that cost hundreds of lives. At Buna in New Guinea, Australian and American soldiers fought for weeks to crack Japanese defensive positions that absorbed everything the Allies threw at them. The problem was always the same: bunkers too strong to destroy with infantry weapons, too well camouflaged to hit with artillery, too well positioned to flank without suffering massive casualties. Standard tactics were brutal and costly. You could try to flank the pillbox, which meant sending men through open ground under crossfire from supporting positions. You could call in artillery or naval gunfire, which required precise coordinates that were nearly impossible when the bunker was invisible, and even direct hits often failed to destroy the structure. You could send men with grenades and flamethrowers to assault the position directly, which worked eventually, but at terrible cost in lives. A single well-positioned pillbox could hold up an entire battalion for hours. Marine officers called them murder holes. The men who had to attack them used words that cannot be repeated here. On Mono Island that October morning, one particular pillbox was causing a disaster that threatened the entire landing operation. It sat near the beach where S-399 had dropped its bow ram. Japanese had positioned it with precision that bordered on genius. Any troops or equipment coming off that ship had to pass directly through its field of fire. No cover on the beach, just open sand stretching toward jungle. The pillbox was constructed from coconut logs layered thick, with a machine gun in placement that commanded the entire landing zone. It housed at least a dozen Japanese soldiers who'd been waiting in silence for hours. The New Zealand 8th Brigade came ashore in the first wave. Veteran soldiers from a country that had been fighting since 1939. They knew what they were doing, but they'd never faced anything quite like this. Japanese let the first Kiwa splash through the shallows and onto the beach, waited until the landing zone was crowded with men and equipment. Then the machine gun opened up. First burst cut down 4 soldiers before anyone realized where the fire was coming from. Men dove for cover, but there was no cover. Beach was flat and exposed. More bursts followed, methodical, deadly. New Zealanders tried to locate the pillbox, tried to return fire, but the bunker was so well camouflaged they couldn't find a target. A sergeant threw a grenade at the general area where fire seemed to be coming from. Grenade bounced off a coconut log and exploded harmlessly in sand. Other men tried the same thing with the same result. Logs absorbed the blasts. Firing slits were too narrow to throw a grenade through. Machine gun kept hammering. Within 15 minutes, the landing had stalled completely. Dead and wounded men lay scattered across the beach. Survivors pressed flat against sand, unable to advance, unwilling to retreat to the water. Meanwhile, Les 399 sat exposed on the beach with its bow ramped down, loaded with vital equipment and supplies. Every minute that ship remained stationary increased the risk of Japanese air attack. One bomb in the right place would destroy tons of ammunition and fuel, kill everyone nearby. The invasion of the Treasury Islands was part of Operation Good Time, a diversionary attack designed to draw Japanese attention away from the main landing at Bougainville. But there was nothing fake about the bullets tearing into New Zealand infantry. Real men were dying on that beach and nobody could figure out how to stop it. Lieutenant Charles E. Turnbull of the Civil Engineer Corps, commanding officer of Company A from the 87th Naval Construction Battalion, had come ashore with 8 Seabees about an hour after the first wave hit the beach. His men had been assigned to clear a road along the coastline so equipment and supplies could move inland once the beachhead was secured. They'd brought 2 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, a jeep, tools of their trade. They were construction workers, not infantry. Rifles slung over shoulders. Primary weapons were supposed to be their machines. But Turnbull could see what was happening, could hear the screams of wounded men and the relentless hammering of the Japanese machine gun, could see New Zealand officers frantically trying to organize some kind of response while their soldiers died on sand. Something had to be done. Infantry had already tried everything they knew. Turnbull looked at his bulldozers, looked at the pillbox, had an idea that violated every military manual ever written about the proper employment of construction equipment. The Seabees existed because of a massacre that haunted American military planners. 11 months before Tassone climbed into his bulldozer at Mono Island, more than 1,000 civilian construction workers had been building a naval air station on Wake Island when the Japanese attacked. These men were employees of Morrison Nuts and Company, one of the largest construction firms in America, recruited from job sites across the country with promises of adventure and wages that seemed impossibly high during the lingering economic struggles of the late Depression years. Most were young men in their 20s and 30s, skilled tradesmen looking to build something and see a part of the world they'd only read about in newspapers. They arrived at Wake Island in summer and fall of 1941. Work was hard, but pay was good. They built runways and fuel storage facilities and barracks, racing against a deadline that everyone knew was coming, even if no one said it out loud. War with Japan was inevitable. Wake Island sat in the middle of the Pacific, roughly halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines. Whoever controlled it would have a critical outpost in any future conflict. December 8, 1941. Hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers appeared over Wake Island. Construction workers scrambled for cover while Marines manned anti-aircraft guns. First attack killed more than 20 civilians and destroyed several aircraft on the ground. More attacks followed over the next 2 weeks. Civilian workers were not supposed to fight. Under international law, non-combatants who took up arms could be executed as guerrillas. But some of them fought anyway. helped Marines reload ammunition and repair damaged equipment, operated construction machinery to fill bomb craters on runways. A few grabbed rifles and joined the defensive perimeter. Wake Island held out for 15 days against overwhelming Japanese forces. Marines and their civilian allies repelled the first landing attempt, sinking 2 Japanese destroyers in the process. But no relief came. December 23rd. Ammunition nearly exhausted and reinforcements nowhere in sight. The garrison surrendered. Japanese captured 1,600 Americans, including more than 1,000 civilian construction workers. What happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Prisoners were stripped and bound with wire, in a way that threatened strangulation if they moved suddenly. Forced to sit on hot concrete, they'd poured themselves without food or water for 2 days. Japanese soldiers installed machine guns nearby. Prisoners waited to die. Eventually, they were fed scraps of spoiled food and loaded onto transport ships bound for prison camps in China and Japan. Civilian workers who'd fought alongside the Marines were now prisoners of war, but their status remained legally ambiguous. They'd been civilians engaged in lawful construction work, not armed or trained for combat. But they'd resisted, and under Japanese interpretation of the rules of war, that resistance could justify their execution. 98 workers were not shipped to the mainland. They were kept on Wake Island to continue construction work for their new Japanese masters. For nearly 2 years, they labored under brutal conditions, building fortifications that would be used against their own countrymen. October 5th, 1943. American carrier aircraft bombed Wake Island as part of ongoing operations to neutralize Japanese bases in the Pacific. Raid itself caused relatively little damage, but it terrified the Japanese commander, Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara. He became convinced an American invasion was imminent. 2 days later, October 7th, Sakaibara made a decision that would eventually cost him his life. He ordered the 98 American civilian prisoners taken to the northern end of Wake Island. They were blindfolded and forced to kneel facing the ocean, machine guns positioned behind them. At Sakaibara's signal, the guns opened fire. 97 men died in the initial massacre. One prisoner somehow escaped in the confusion. He made his way back to the execution site and carved a message into a coral rock near where his friends had been buried in a mass grave. The message read, 98 was PW 51043. The date was written in the American style, month first. October 5th, 1943. The escaped prisoner did not remain free for long. He was recaptured within days. Sakaibara personally beheaded him with a katana sword. The massacre of the Wake Island civilians proved what American military planners had already realized. Construction workers were essential to the Pacific War effort, but they couldn't operate safely in combat zones. Couldn't defend themselves without losing their protected status under international law, and couldn't simply be left unarmed while Japanese forces were willing to murder prisoners without hesitation. Rear Admiral Ben Morrell had seen this problem coming before Pearl Harbor. As chief of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, Morrell understood better than anyone the construction challenges that lay ahead. Pacific War would be fought across thousands of miles of ocean, on islands ranging from tiny coral atolls to jungle-covered mountains. American forces would need bases everywhere, places to land aircraft and refuel ships and store supplies. Those bases didn't exist. They would have to be built from nothing, often under fire, on terrain that offered no natural advantages. You couldn't rely on civilian contractors for that work. Wake Island had proven that. You needed military men who could build and fight. Men who would be legally entitled to carry weapons and defend themselves. Men who could operate bulldozers 1 minute and man machine guns the next. December 28, 1941. 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Morrell requested authority to create a new kind of military unit. January 5, 1942. The Bureau of Navigation approved his plan. 1st Naval Construction Battalion was formed. Within weeks, Morrell was recruiting construction workers from across America. The early Seabees were unlike any military unit that had ever existed. Morrell wanted experienced men, not raw recruits who'd need months of training to learn a trade. He recruited from the construction industry, targeting workers who'd built the great projects of the Depression era. Men who'd worked on the Hoover Dam applied. So did men who'd built the Golden Gate Bridge and the highways that crisscrossed the nation. These were skilled tradesmen, journeymen and master craftsmen, men who already knew how to operate heavy equipment and pour concrete and wire electrical systems. The average age of the first 60 Seabee battalions was 37. Some men well past 60 managed to lie about their ages and get accepted. One Seabee famously had no teeth left, and when questioned about it, replied that he didn't think they were planning on having him bite the enemy. Recruiting officers looked the other way. Experience mattered more than youth. Marines trained them in combat. For 3 weeks, construction workers learned to shoot rifles and throw grenades and dig foxholes and defend a perimeter against enemy attack. Hand-to-hand combat and patrol tactics and the basics of small unit operations. Crash course in warfare compressed into the shortest possible time frame because the Pacific theater needed them urgently. But their primary weapon was always the bulldozer. A caterpillar deet in the hands of a skilled operator was worth a platoon of infantry when it came to construction work. These machines could clear jungle, build roads, grade airstrips, transform a worthless atoll into a functioning military base in days rather than months. The Seabees brought the construction might of industrial America to the most remote corners of the Pacific. Morrell gave his new force a motto in Latin, Construmimus Batuimus. We build, we fight. He commissioned a logo showing an angry bee wearing a sailor's cap and carrying both construction tools and a Tommy gun. The image captured the essence of what the Seabees were meant to be: construction workers first, warriors when necessary. By October 1943, Seabees had proven themselves at Guadalcanal and a dozen other islands across the Pacific. They'd built Henderson Field under constant Japanese bombardment, filling bomb craters almost as fast as the enemy could create them. They'd constructed harbors and fuel depots and hospitals, and all the infrastructure that modern warfare required. They'd fought alongside Marines when their bases came under attack, buried their dead in cemeteries they'd built themselves. But no one had considered using a bulldozer as a weapon. Not until Aurelio Tassone sat in his machine on that beach at Mono Island and watched the New Zealanders die. Lieutenant Turnbull made the decision that would change everything. He walked across sand to where Tassone sat in his bulldozer, staying low to avoid Japanese fire, still sweeping the beach. The two men knew each other well. Trained together at Camp Peary, the Seabee base in Virginia. Crossed the Pacific together on the same transport ship. Turnbull trusted Tassone because Tassone was one of the best equipment operators in the battalion. If anyone could do what Turnbull was thinking, it would be him. Turnbull pointed at the pillbox tearing apart the New Zealand infantry. Bunker was partially visible now about 70 yards away, its coconut log construction blending into jungle at the edge of the beach. Bullets still snapping overhead. Screams of wounded men filling the air. "Can you do something about that?" Turnbull asked. Tassone looked at the bunker, looked at his bulldozer. The blade was raised in front of the cab, massive curved piece of steel designed to push earth and debris. It weighed several thousand pounds by itself. The Date was powered by a diesel engine that could push through almost anything short of solid rock. Tassone had cleared stumps and boulders with this machine. He'd knocked down buildings. A pillbox made of coconut logs and sand wasn't that different from a debris pile. Just a debris pile that was trying to kill him. Tassone didn't hesitate. He raised the blade high, positioning it directly in front of the operator's seat like a shield. Steel was thick enough to stop rifle and machine gun bullets. Probably not artillery, but it would have to do. Then he put the bulldozer in gear and started moving toward the Japanese position. The machine gun opened fire immediately. Bullets clanged off the blade, sparking and ricocheting in all directions. Sound was deafening. Metal on metal. Hammer of automatic weapons fire mixed with roar of diesel engine beneath Tassone's feet. He hunched down as low as he could while still being able to see over the blade. Machine gun rounds were punching into the steel, some leaving dents he could feel through vibrations traveling up through the frame. Lieutenant Turnbull was running alongside the bulldozer, slightly behind and to the right, firing his carbine at the pillbox's firing slits. He couldn't hit anything from that distance while running. But that wasn't the point. The point was to make the Japanese gunners duck, disrupt their aim, give Tassone a few extra seconds. New Zealanders saw what was happening and added their own covering fire. Rifles cracked from positions all along the beach. Grenades thrown toward the bunker, not to destroy it, but to create confusion. Smoke and dirt filled the air around the pillbox. Tassone kept driving. The bulldozer moved at walking speed, maybe 3 miles per hour on soft sand. It felt like he was crawling toward that machine gun at agonizing pace. Every second stretched into minutes. He could hear bullets whining past his head, some coming through gaps in the blade's protection. One round punched through the thin metal of the cab roof above him and exited the other side without hitting anything vital. Tassone had named his bulldozer Helen after his wife. He'd painted her name on the side of the machine back at base camp, the way some men named their aircraft or their tanks. Now Helen was about to become the first bulldozer in history to assault an enemy fortification. The distance closed. 50 yards, 40 yards, 30 yards. Tassone could see the logs of the pillbox clearly now. Thick coconut trunks stacked horizontally and bound together with wire and rope. He could see the dark, narrow slits where the machine gun was mounted. Muzzle flashes flickered in those slits like lightning in a storm cloud. More bullets slammed into the blade. Some came through, whining past his head, punching holes in the air around him. 20 yards. Machine gun fire intensified. Japanese gunners realized what was happening. They couldn't depress their weapon low enough to hit the bulldozer's tracks or engine. Their only target was the blade and the man crouching behind it. They poured everything they had into that target. 10 yards. Tassone dropped the blade. 24 tons of steel and diesel power slammed into the front of the pillbox at full throttle. Blade struck the coconut logs at chest height and kept going. Wood splintered with sounds like rifle shots. Sand exploded in all directions, filling the air with grit that stung Tassone's eyes and filled his mouth. The entire structure collapsed inward like a house of cards. But Tassone didn't stop. He kept the throttle wide open, grinding forward, pushing the wreckage down into the earth. Treads churned over broken logs and sand and things he didn't want to think about. Engine screamed with the effort of pushing so much debris. Blades scraped along the ground, compacting everything beneath it into a flat mass. When Tassone finally backed the bulldozer away, there was nothing left but a churned patch of earth. No logs, no firing slits, no bunker, just flat ground where a Japanese strongpoint had been moments before. Investigators would dig up the site later that day. They found 12 Japanese bodies buried beneath the debris along with a heavy machine gun and more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Soldiers had still been at their positions when the bulldozer hit. They died almost instantly, crushed under tons of earth and timber. The entire assault had lasted only minutes. Pillbox that had held up the landing for the better part of an hour had been demolished by a single man in a single machine making a single decision. The implications of what had just happened would take time to fully sink in. But the immediate effect was obvious. Beach was clear. The advance could continue. New Zealanders stared in disbelief. They'd been fighting that pillbox for the better part of an hour, losing good men with every attempt to silence it. Grenades had bounced off coconut logs without effect. Rifle fire accomplished nothing against narrow firing slits. They'd been considering calling for naval gunfire support, which would have taken hours to coordinate and might not have destroyed the bunker anyway. And a construction worker from Massachusetts had just demolished it with a bulldozer. Kiwi soldiers stood up from their positions along the beach and watched as Tassone backed his machine away from the flattened wreckage. Some cheered. Others just stared, minds trying to process what they'd witnessed. An officer ran over to look at the remains of the pillbox, now just a churned mass of broken timber and sand. He could see parts of the machine gun sticking up through the debris. He could see other things too, things he wouldn't describe in his official report. Lieutenant Turnbull jogged up to the machine, his carbine still smoking from covering fire he'd provided. Both men breathing hard, ears ringing from the combination of gunfire and engine noise. Tassone's hands were shaking on the controls, adrenaline still flooding his system. His mouth was dry, and his heart was hammering in his chest. He'd just killed 12 men. Killed them with a construction tool, the same kind of machine he'd operated on job sites back home, moving dirt and clearing land for shopping centers and housing developments. It worked, Tassone said. Those two words contained a world of meaning. They acknowledged what had happened, expressed relief that he was still alive, and pointed toward a future neither man could have imagined, a future where bulldozers would become weapons of war and construction workers would drive them into enemy fortifications across the Pacific. The landing operation resumed immediately. With the pillbox destroyed, troops and equipment could move off last 399 without being cut down by machine gun fire. New Zealand advance continued inland. More Seabees came ashore with more equipment. By nightfall, they'd cleared enough of a road for vehicles to move along the beach. The next day, they began the work they'd come to do, building airstrips and radar stations and all the infrastructure that Operation Good Time required. News of Tassone's improvised assault spread through the military with remarkable speed. Within days, reports reached headquarters at Guadalcanal and then back to Pearl Harbor, describing how a Seabee had used a bulldozer to destroy a Japanese fortification that had resisted conventional attack. Officers who'd spent months trying to crack coconut log bunkers suddenly saw a new possibility. The bulldozer wasn't just a construction tool. It was a weapon, one that could go places tanks couldn't reach and accomplish things artillery couldn't achieve. The tactical advantages were obvious once someone took the time to think about them. A Date bulldozer was nearly impossible to stop with small arms fire. Blade provided excellent protection for the operator when raised properly. Machine had low ground pressure despite its weight, allowing it to traverse soft sand and mud that would bog down a tank. It could push through obstacles that would stop lighter vehicles. And unlike a tank, which required specialized training and support infrastructure, a bulldozer could be operated by any skilled construction worker. More importantly, the bulldozer left behind a cleared path other vehicles could follow. This was something tanks couldn't do. A tank destroyed an obstacle and then sat on top of the wreckage. A bulldozer destroyed an obstacle and pushed the debris aside, opening a road. Within weeks, other Seabee units were experimenting with similar tactics. At Cape Gloucester in New Britain in late December 1943, Seabees bulldozed paths directly through Japanese defensive lines, so Marine tanks could advance into positions that had previously been unreachable. They learned that the key was coordination between infantry, armor, and construction equipment. Infantry provided covering fire to keep Japanese suppressed. Bulldozer operator kept the blade raised as a shield until the moment of impact. When the machine reached the bunker, blade dropped and the structure collapsed. Then tanks or infantry could move through the gap. Japanese had no counter to this tactic. Their pillboxes had been designed to resist explosives and gunfire, not brute mechanical force. A 24-ton bulldozer pushing at full power generated more crushing force than any artillery shell. Coconut logs that had been so effective at absorbing blast damage simply crumbled under sustained mechanical pressure. The physics were inescapable. You couldn't build a field fortification strong enough to resist being physically pushed into the ground by a machine that weighed as much as 5 automobiles. By early 1944, bulldozer assaults on pillboxes had become standard part of Seabee operations. Techniques spread from unit to unit, passed along by word of mouth and demonstrated in training exercises. Seabees who'd been recruited to build roads and airstrips were now being asked to destroy enemy fortifications. Their construction equipment had become weapons of war. Japanese noticed something had changed. Intelligence reports from late 43 and early 44 mentioned American construction equipment being used in unexpected ways. Japanese officers who'd relied on their pillbox defenses suddenly found those defenses crumbling under mechanical assault. Timing of attacks shifted. American forces no longer threw infantry against bunkers in costly frontal assaults. Instead, they waited for the bulldozers to arrive. Japanese commanders at regional headquarters tried to understand what was happening. Field reports described American tractors rolling directly toward defensive positions, absorbing machine gun fire, then destroying bunkers through brute force. Some officers initially dismissed these reports as exaggerations or misidentifications. Surely the Americans were using tanks, not construction equipment. But descriptions were consistent. Machines had no turrets. They had large blades mounted on the front. They moved slowly, but unstoppably, toward their targets. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was significant. Soldiers who'd felt safe inside their fortifications now knew that safety was an illusion. Coconut log bunkers that had protected them for months could be destroyed in minutes by a single American driving a construction machine. Some Japanese defenders began abandoning their bunkers when they saw bulldozers approaching. They'd rather take their chances in the open, fighting American infantry with rifles, than wait inside a bunker for the walls to collapse around them. This played directly into American hands, since infantry in the open was much easier to deal with than infantry dug into fortified positions. The bulldozer had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Japanese veterans who survived the war would later describe the terror of hearing a bulldozer engine approaching their position. Sound was distinctive, deep diesel rumble quite different from a tank's engine note. When you heard that sound and knew what it meant, you had to make a choice. Stay in your bunker and possibly be buried alive, or leave your bunker and face American rifles and grenades in the open. Neither option was good. Americans had found a way to make every option bad. The Japanese military had no equivalent to the Seabees. Their construction work was performed by army engineering units or by conscripted labor forces. They didn't have the same depth of skilled tradesmen that America's industrial economy had produced. More importantly, they didn't have thousands of heavy bulldozers sitting in warehouses waiting to be shipped overseas. Japan's industrial capacity was strained to the breaking point just producing weapons and ammunition. Civilian construction equipment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Some Japanese units tried to adapt. They built their bunkers deeper underground, hoping bulldozer blades couldn't reach them. They excavated into hillsides and covered entrances with camouflage. But underground bunkers had their own problems. Harder to ventilate, flooded easily in tropical climate. And once Americans knew where they were, a bulldozer could simply seal the entrance and entomb the defenders inside. Other units positioned anti-tank weapons to target construction equipment. But this required exposing the gun crew to American rifle fire, and the deed bulldozer was a harder target to hit than a tank. It sat lower to the ground and had no obvious weak points. Blade protected the engine and operator from frontal fire. Even if you hit the machine, you might not stop it. A day could absorb tremendous damage and keep moving. Some Japanese engineers experimented with reinforced concrete bunkers instead of coconut logs. Concrete was stronger than wood and might resist the bulldozer's blade. But cement was in desperately short supply across the Pacific theater. What little existed was needed for airfield construction and major fortifications. Field units couldn't obtain enough to build concrete pillboxes. They were stuck with coconut logs, and coconut logs crumbled under mechanical pressure. The tactical balance in the Pacific had shifted. For 2 years, Japanese defensive doctrine relied on fortified positions that could absorb enormous punishment while inflicting heavy casualties on attacking forces. That doctrine was now obsolete. The bulldozer had changed the rules of engagement. The Fighting Seabees, a Hollywood movie starring John Wayne, was released in January 1944. Republic Pictures had recognized that the Seabees were a story that would resonate with American audiences. The climactic scene showed Wayne's character using a bulldozer to destroy a Japanese fuel depot. The movie was enormously popular. It made Seabee a household word across America and helped recruit thousands of new volunteers for the construction battalions. Aurelio Tassone himself became a minor celebrity in 1944. The Navy brought him back to the United States for a war bond tour, sending him to speak at factories and public gatherings. At the Caterpillar plant in Peoria, Illinois, he addressed the workers who built the date bulldozers that Seabees were using across the Pacific. He told them about Mono Island, about raising the blade and driving into machine gun fire, about the feeling of the logs splintering under the weight of the machine. Workers listened in stunned silence. They'd built those bulldozers for construction work, knew every bolt and weld in those machines. Now they understood that their bulldozers were weapons of war, that a piece of equipment they'd assembled on a factory floor was being used to kill enemy soldiers on the other side of the world. Tassone appeared at war bond rallies across the country, standing on stages and telling audiences how an ordinary construction worker had destroyed a Japanese bunker with nothing but a bulldozer and raw courage. The crowds loved him. Here was proof that working-class Americans, men with calloused hands and practical skills, could defeat the enemy through ingenuity and determination. You didn't need to be a soldier to win the war. You just needed to do your job and see opportunities others missed. But the real impact of Tassone's innovation was measured in lives saved, not in newspaper headlines. The statistics from the Pacific Theater told the story clearly. Before the bulldozer tactic became widespread, American forces typically suffered heavy casualties when attacking fortified Japanese positions. Assault on Tarawa in November 43 had cost more than 1,000 Marine dead, many killed attacking coconut log bunkers that seemed impervious to everything the Americans threw at them. After bulldozer assaults became standard, casualty rates in similar operations dropped significantly. Bunkers were still there, but they could be dealt with efficiently instead of requiring costly infantry assaults. By the time American forces reached the Marianas in mid-1944, bulldozer tactics had become routine. On Saipan, Seabees worked alongside Marine infantry to crack Japanese defensive lines that would have taken days or weeks to reduce through conventional methods. Within 4 days of capturing the main Japanese airfield, Seabees had it operational for American aircraft. They accomplished this while fighting off counterattacks, repairing battle damage, and continuing their primary mission of construction. Speed of Seabee construction work repeatedly shocked both American commanders and Japanese intelligence officers, who couldn't believe how quickly Americans could establish functioning bases. On Tinian, Seabees helped clear the way for construction of airfields that would change the course of history. They built North Field, the largest operational airfield in the world at the time, with 4 runways, each more than a mile long. The island's runways would eventually launch the B-29 bombers that carried atomic weapons to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those runways were built by Seabees, many of whom used their bulldozers as weapons before they used them as construction equipment. The Enola Gay and Boxcar, the aircraft that dropped the atomic bombs, both took off from runways that Seabees had constructed. Iwo Jima was the bloodiest chapter in Seabee history. The island was a volcanic nightmare. 8 square miles of black sand and sulfur vents defended by more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers dug into caves and tunnels. Seabees from the 31st and 133rd Construction Battalions landed with the second wave on February 19, 1945. Just 60 minutes behind the Marine assault troops. They came ashore into a killing ground. Japanese mortars and artillery had been pre-registered on every inch of beach. Black volcanic sand was so soft that vehicles bogged down almost immediately. Seabees jumped off their landing craft and sank to their knees in ash. They dragged steel matting across the beach to create paths vehicles could use. They unloaded supplies under fire. They bulldozed debris and filled craters while bullets and shell fragments filled the air around them. The 133rd Battalion suffered the highest casualty rate in Seabee history at Iwo Jima. Hundreds of their men killed or wounded in the 36 days of fighting. But they kept building. Within days of the initial landing, they had the first airstrip operational. Damaged B-29s that couldn't make it back to their bases in the Marianas began landing on Iwo Jima instead. Each emergency landing represented 10 or 11 crew members who might otherwise have died at sea. Seabees at Iwo Jima worked around the clock, often under fire. They graded runways while mortar shells exploded nearby. They filled bomb craters that appeared in completed taxiways. They built revetments to protect aircraft from enemy fire and constructed fuel storage facilities that kept American planes flying. The work was relentless and dangerous, but they never stopped. Every hour they worked brought more damaged aircraft to safety. By end of the war, more than 2,400 B-29s had made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. The airstrips that enabled those landings were built by Seabees, often under fire, using the same bulldozers and construction techniques that Aurelio Tassone had pioneered at Mono Island. Admiral William Halsey visited Iwo Jima after the battle and saw what the Seabees had accomplished. 3 airstrips carved from volcanic rock and black sand, supply depots and fuel storage facilities, all the infrastructure needed to support air operations over Japan. If necessary, Halsey told reporters, they will build another island and put 4 or 5 airfields there. That wasn't entirely a joke. Seabees had proven they could do almost anything. Aurelio Tassone and Charles Turnbull both received the Silver Star for their actions on October 27, 1943. Tassone was also promoted to machinist's mate first class. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy. It mentioned the 12 Japanese soldiers killed and the pillbox destroyed. It did not mention that Tassone had essentially invented a new form of warfare without orders, training, or precedent. The broader Seabee contribution to victory in the Pacific is staggering in its scope. By end of the war, 325,000 men had served in the Naval Construction Battalions. They built 111 major airstrips across the Pacific theater. They constructed 4,541 piers and docks. They built 25,558 ammunition magazines and 700 city blocks worth of warehouses. They created hospitals capable of serving 70,000 patients and fuel storage facilities holding 100 million gallons of gasoline. They built housing for 1.5 million military personnel. The awards tell part of the story. Seabees earned 5 Navy Crosses, the second highest decoration for valor in the Navy. They earned 33 Silver Stars. They earned more than 2,000 Purple Hearts. These were construction workers, men who'd signed up to build, not to fight. But when the fighting came to them, they fought. The decorations were proof that construction workers could be warriors, that the skills learned building highways and bridges and dams translated into skills that could win battles and save lives. The casualties tell another part. 272 enlisted men and 18 officers were killed in combat during World War II. Another 500 died in construction accidents, because building airstrips and harbors in remote locations under wartime conditions was inherently dangerous work, even without the enemy shooting at you. Construction has always been a hazardous profession. Seabees just did it in more hazardous places than most. The 87th Naval Construction Battalion continued operations through the end of the war. After the Treasury Islands, they participated in further operations across the Solomon Islands chain. On nearby Sterling Island, they built an airstrip that became operational within weeks of initial landing. They constructed 21 miles of roads through jungle terrain, established a radar station for early warning against Japanese air attacks, built a PT boat base that extended American naval reach deeper into enemy waters. They built airstrips and harbor facilities on islands whose names have mostly been forgotten. They lost more men to combatant accidents. They earned more decorations. And they never forgot what Aurelio Tassone had done on that beach at Mono Island. The battalion later served on Okinawa in the final months of the war, continuing their construction work even as kamikaze attacks threatened American positions. Throughout their service, the 87th NCB embodied the Seabee motto. They built, they fought, and when the job was done, they moved on to the next one. The battalion published a cruise book after the war titled The Earth Mover, a bound volume documenting their service. It included photographs of their construction projects, portraits of their officers and men, and accounts of significant events. The assault on the pillbox at Mono Island received its own section. The cruise book called it a landmark moment in Seabee history, the first time a bulldozer was used as an assault weapon. Copies of that cruise book still exist in military archives and veterans' collections. Captain Shigematsu Sakaebara, the Japanese officer who'd ordered the massacre of the 98 civilian workers on Wake Island, surrendered to American forces at end of the war. He'd been promoted to Rear Admiral in October 1944, a year after the massacre. He was arrested and charged with war crimes. At his trial, he admitted ordering the executions but claimed he was acting under the fog of war, believing an American invasion was imminent. The military tribunal did not accept this defense. Sakaebara was found guilty and sentenced to death. June 1947 Tart. He was executed by hanging on Guam. His last words reportedly included an expression of regret that his trial had been unfair and his sentence too harsh, but he said he accepted it with pleasure. History has not recorded what the families of the 98 murdered workers thought of his expressions of regret. Ben Morrell, the admiral who'd created the Seabees, retired from the Navy in 1946 as a 4-star admiral. He was the first Staff Corps officer in Navy history to hold that rank, a distinction that recognized both his wartime achievements and the political battles he'd won to give the Civil Engineer Corps command authority over their own units. After the war, he became chairman and president of Jones and Laughlin Steel Company, one of the nation's largest steel manufacturers, and continued to champion the legacy of the force he'd built. Morrell remained proud of the Seabees until his death in 1978 at age 85. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. He'd created something unprecedented, a military construction force that could build anything, anywhere, under any conditions. The Seabees, he often said, had proven that construction workers could be warriors, and that the tools of building could also be instruments of victory. His legacy lived on in every Seabee who followed, in every airstrip built under fire, in every bulldozer that became a weapon when the situation demanded it. The date bulldozer that Tassone used to destroy the pillbox at Mono Island was not preserved as a memorial. It went on to clear jungle and build roads on other islands, doing the work it had been designed for. Construction equipment rarely becomes famous. Machines are tools, and tools are used until they wear out, then replaced. There is no monument to Helen the bulldozer anywhere in the world. But the tactic that Tassone invented lived on far beyond the war that produced it. In Vietnam, Seabees operated construction equipment in combat zones throughout the conflict, 26,000 serving at peak strength. In 1968, 12 Seabee battalions served in-country, building bases, roads, and airfields, while sometimes coming under enemy fire. 85 Seabees were killed in Vietnam, continuing the tradition of construction workers who built and fought where necessary. The lessons of Mono Island were passed down through generations of military engineers. Modern military includes armored bulldozers specifically designed for combat engineering. The Caterpillar 9, a descendant of the D8 that Tassone operated, can be fitted with armored cabs and ballistic protection that allow operators to work under fire with relative safety. The Israeli Defense Forces developed the 9 into one of the most heavily armored bulldozers in the world, capable of demolishing structures and clearing obstacles while withstanding enemy fire. These machines can clear minefields, breach obstacles, demolish fortifications, create pathways through urban rubble. They're standard equipment in military engineering units around the world. Every one of them traces its lineage back to that morning on Mono Island, when Aurelio Tassone raised his blade and drove into enemy fire. None of that would have happened quite the way it did if a construction worker from Milford, Massachusetts hadn't looked at an impossible problem and seen an unconventional solution. Tassone didn't ask for permission, didn't consult a manual or wait for orders. He saw men dying, and he had a machine that could stop the killing. So he drove his bulldozer into a Japanese pillbox and changed the way wars are fought. Aurelio Tassone returned to Massachusetts after the war ended. He didn't write memoirs or seek speaking engagements. He lived quietly and rarely talked about what he'd done at Mono Island unless someone specifically asked. But other veterans remembered. Men who'd been on that beach on October 27, 1943, never forgot what they'd seen. A construction worker raising a bulldozer blade like a shield, machine gun bullets sparking off steel, a fortification that had killed their friends crumbling under the weight of a civilian machine turned into a weapon. That's the Seabee way. We build, we fight, and when the job is done, we move on to the next one without waiting for medals or recognition. The work is what matters. The lives saved are what matters. Everything else is just noise.